He spent 7 years in prison convinced he had killed his wife, until the day she walked into the visitation room, alive, and holding the truth that would shatter everything he thought he knew. Ethan and Laura Miles appeared to have everything a couple could hope for. Their home sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees, where neighbors often waved as they passed by. Ethan was a talented architect who took pride in designing beautiful homes, while Laura worked as a freelance photographer whose work often appeared in travel magazines. They were the kind of couple that people envied, young, successful, and seemingly happy. On weekends, they hosted small gatherings, sharing laughter and stories about their latest trips. Yet behind the smiles and compliments, their relationship had started to crumble. Ethan's obsession with control grew stronger over time. He wanted things neat, predictable, and perfect, while Laura longed for freedom, adventure, and spontaneity. Their differences, once charming, became sources of constant tension. She began spending more time alone, wandering with her camera, while he buried himself in work. Evenings at home turned quiet and uncomfortable, filled with unspoken words and sideways glances. Friends noticed the change but assumed it was just a rough patch. No one knew about the arguments that happened behind closed doors or the way Ethan's temper sometimes flashed without warning. Laura had begun to keep a suitcase under the bed, packed with essentials she might need if she ever decided to leave. Ethan, meanwhile, pretended not to notice the growing distance. He convinced himself that they just needed time, that love could fix everything if they stayed together long enough. But deep down, he knew something was slipping away, something he couldn't rebuild with blueprints or careful planning. Their marriage, once full of warmth, had turned into a fragile structure held together by memories of better days. And though neither realized it, their perfect life was about to collapse in the most devastating way imaginable. The storm began as a low rumble in the distance, a warning that something unsettling was coming. By nightfall, rain pounded against the windows of the Miles house, wind rattling the shutters as lightning streaked across the sky. Inside, tension hung thicker than the humid air. Laura sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, her packed suitcase beside her chair. She had made up her mind to leave that night. Ethan stood in the kitchen, pacing, his thoughts restless and heavy. He had sensed something was wrong all week. Her distant tone, the way she avoided his eyes, the sudden phone calls she wouldn't explain. When she finally told him she needed space, the words hit him harder than any storm could. Outside, thunder cracked as their voices rose. The neighbors would later say they heard shouting, then something crashing, glass, perhaps a vase, breaking against the floor. A light flickered, and then silence. Moments later, the street went dark as the power cut out. When the storm finally passed, so had Laura. By morning, she was gone. Her car keys remained on the counter, and her phone lay on the floor near a broken lamp. Ethan claimed she left in anger, slamming the door behind her, but something about the scene didn't match his story. Police officers arrived after a neighbor called, concerned by the noise and the sight of Ethan wandering the front yard in the rain. Inside, they found drops of blood leading from the kitchen to the back door and signs of a struggle. The house smelled faintly of iron and rain. Laura's absence was immediate, chilling, and unexplained. Ethan's trembling hands and blank stare only deepened the suspicion that the storm had taken more than just the power that night. The investigation into Laura's disappearance began with urgency, but quickly turned into a mystery that gripped the entire community. Search teams combed through nearby forests, drained sections of the river, and checked abandoned cabins within miles of their home. Nothing turned up. No trace of Laura's body, no clothing, no footprints, just silence. Detectives focused on Ethan, the last person to see her alive. They questioned his version of events, noting inconsistencies in his timeline. He said Laura left around midnight, but several neighbors reported hearing noises closer to 1 a.m. The blood found in the kitchen matched Laura's DNA, and a towel stained with the same blood was discovered hidden beneath the sink. Ethan insisted it was from an earlier injury, but no record supported that claim. Investigators found shards of broken glass in the trash and scratches on Ethan's wrist. They searched his car, uncovering traces of mud and faint blood smears near the trunk, though not enough to confirm anything conclusive. Without a body, the case remained circumstantial, yet the evidence pointed heavily toward foul play. The prosecution argued that Ethan's jealousy and temper had driven him to kill his wife during the argument. The defense claimed Laura had run away and that Ethan was being punished for her decision to disappear. Still, the jury was swayed by the blood, the inconsistencies, and Ethan's strange calm during questioning. In a courtroom filled with tension, he sat motionless as the verdict was read, guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, his fate sealed by what everyone believed was undeniable truth. As he was led away in handcuffs, Ethan looked back only once, half expecting Laura to walk through the courtroom doors and end the nightmare. But she never came. Prison life stripped Ethan of everything he once was. The days blended together into a blur of concrete walls, metallic clanks, and distant shouts. He kept to himself, avoiding fights and conversations, preferring the silence of his cell to the noise of the prison yard. The other inmates called him the quiet architect, mocking his habit of sketching buildings on scraps of paper with a dull pencil. Those drawings became his only escape, blueprints of imaginary homes where the light always reached every corner, unlike the darkness that now surrounded him. At night, he lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, replaying the night of the storm over and over. Each time, the scene changed slightly in his mind, as if his memory were rewriting itself. Sometimes he saw Laura walking away unharmed. Other times, he saw her lifeless on the kitchen floor. He could no longer tell which version was real. The guilt consumed him slowly, eating away at his sense of identity. He stopped responding to letters from old friends and refused all visits from family. The only thing he kept close was a small photograph of Laura that he'd hidden in a torn book cover. He would take it out only at night, whispering silent apologies into the air. As the years passed, his reflection in the mirror became almost unrecognizable. Gray hair at his temples, eyes dull with regret, shoulders bent from exhaustion. Yet something inside him refused to let go of the belief that maybe, just maybe, Laura was still out there somewhere. The uncertainty was both his punishment and his only hope. Every dream he had ended the same way, with rain tapping against a window and Laura's shadow fading into the storm. He never stopped wondering what really happened that night. 7 years into his sentence, Ethan's routine had become mechanical. He woke before dawn, swept the corridor floors, ate in silence, and spent his afternoons sketching in the prison library. Nothing ever changed, until the morning he received an envelope with no return address. The handwriting was neat, curved, and strangely familiar. Inside was a single piece of paper bearing only 6 words. "You don't know the whole truth." Ethan's heart raced as he read it again and again. His mind flooded with questions. Who had sent it? What truth could there be left to tell? For the rest of the day, he could barely eat. That night, he dreamt of Laura standing at the end of a long corridor, whispering something he couldn't hear. When he awoke, the message still echoed in his mind. Over the next few weeks, he received 2 more letters. The second contained only the words "I forgive you," written in the same elegant script. The third had no message at all, just a pressed daisy, one Laura used to tuck behind her ear when they first met. Ethan's hands trembled as he held it. The scent of paper and faint traces of lavender made the air feel heavy with memory. He showed the letters to no one, terrified they might vanish if he spoke of them. Some nights, he convinced himself they were from Laura. Other nights, he feared someone was toying with him, reopening old wounds for their own amusement. Still, a spark of hope flickered inside him for the first time in years. He began counting the days, waiting for another letter to arrive, something, anything, that might explain the mystery. Deep down, he sensed the truth was closer than he dared believe, and it was coming straight toward him. The morning of the visit began like any other. Ethan was called to the warden's office without explanation, something that rarely happened. He assumed it was about parole paperwork or another review that would end the same way, denied. But when he was led into the visitation room, a strange stillness filled the air. On the other side of the glass sat a woman with short brown hair and tired eyes. For a moment, Ethan thought his mind was playing tricks on him. His breath caught, and the world around him seemed to freeze. It was Laura. Older, thinner, her face marked by years he hadn't shared with her, but unmistakably Laura. Every muscle in his body went numb. The guard glanced at him, waiting for him to sit, but Ethan couldn't move. His heart pounded so hard, he could barely hear the hum of the room. Laura didn't speak. She simply watched him with a calm, unreadable expression. After what felt like forever, she slid an envelope across the counter toward the guard, nodding for it to be given to him. Then she stood up and walked away. Ethan wanted to shout, to ask where she'd been, to demand answers, but his voice refused to come. He pressed his hand against the glass, trembling, as she disappeared through the door. The guard asked if he was all right, but Ethan only stared at the empty chair where she had sat moments before. His world, built on guilt and loss, had just been shattered. Back in his cell, he clutched the envelope like something sacred. He didn't open it for hours, too afraid of what he might find inside. When he finally did, the paper carried her handwriting again, soft, familiar, and hauntingly simple. It read, "You need to know everything." Ethan read the letter over and over until the words blurred. It was Laura's handwriting, there was no doubt. The letter unfolded the truth he had spent years torturing himself over. That night, when the storm raged and their argument reached its breaking point, he had pushed her in a moment of anger. She had slipped and hit her head against the edge of the counter. Panicked and certain she was dead, he ran into the rain, desperate to think, to breathe, to escape what he believed he had done. But while he was gone, Laura regained consciousness. Dizzy and terrified, she had looked around the blood-stained kitchen, convinced Ethan would return and finish what he started. In blind fear, she packed a few things and disappeared into the storm. She didn't call for help, didn't tell anyone where she was going. She used the money she had secretly saved and moved to another city, changing her name and starting a new life. For years, she followed news about the case from afar, watching as Ethan's photo appeared on every channel. Guilt grew heavier with each passing day, but fear kept her silent. She convinced herself that coming forward would destroy them both. Yet 7 years later, she could no longer live with what she had done. She had never intended for him to suffer this long. Ethan felt the weight of the truth crush him. The anger, the confusion, the grief, everything tangled together in unbearable silence. He realized that the memory haunting him wasn't murder, but tragedy and fear colliding on one terrible night. She hadn't died. She had simply vanished, leaving him imprisoned not just by walls, but by his own guilt. As he folded the letter, a strange calm settled in. For the first time, he finally remembered everything. When Laura came forward to the authorities, the world was stunned. Her reappearance made headlines across the country, reigniting a case everyone thought was closed forever. Investigators reopened the file and compared her written testimony with the evidence from years earlier. Her description of that night matched every detail: the blood on the counter, the broken glass, the missing towel, and the moment she fled. It became clear that Ethan had never intended to harm her. What happened was an accident, followed by a terrible misunderstanding that grew into a tragedy. Laura admitted she had been too afraid to face the truth, too consumed by guilt and shame to come forward sooner. She told reporters she had watched Ethan's trial on television, crying as he was sentenced for a crime he didn't commit. For 7 years, she carried that secret like a shadow, until it finally became too heavy to bear. After weeks of legal review, the court overturned Ethan's conviction, citing newly discovered evidence and Laura's sworn statement. The judge ordered his immediate release. When Ethan walked out of the prison gates, the flash of cameras blinded him. Reporters shouted questions, asking how it felt to be free, to see his wife alive after all this time. But Ethan said nothing. His expression was empty, unreadable, as if part of him still belonged to the years he had lost. Laura stood a few steps away, tears streaking her face, but he didn't approach her. The world saw a miracle, a man reunited with the wife he thought he'd killed. But for Ethan, it wasn't a reunion. It was the unearthing of pain buried too deep for words. Freedom had come, but the cost was everything he once was. Nothing could return the 7 years stolen by silence and fear. Freedom was not what Ethan had imagined during his long years behind bars. The world outside had moved on without him, faster and colder than he remembered. He rented a small apartment overlooking the gray coastline, where the wind howled through cracked windows and waves crashed endlessly against the rocks below. His days passed quietly, spent walking along the shore or sitting alone at a cafe where no one recognized him. He didn't seek attention, didn't want pity, and spoke to almost no one. The media called his release a story of redemption. but Ethan felt nothing redemptive about it. The nightmares continued, only now there were no bars to contain them. He often woke drenched in sweat, hearing the echo of rain and Laura's faint cries in his mind. Letters from her began arriving again, soft apologies written in the same familiar hand. She wanted to meet, to explain, to try and heal what time had broken. But Ethan couldn't bring himself to answer. He had spent too many years trapped in the memory of her absence to face her presence again. The thought of seeing her stirred a mix of anger and sorrow he couldn't untangle. Months passed before Laura finally appeared at his door, but he didn't open it. From behind the curtain, he watched her leave a letter on the steps and walk away slowly, shoulders trembling as the wind lifted her hair. Inside the envelope, her words spoke of forgiveness and hope, of starting over somewhere far away. Ethan read it once and then fed it to the fire, watching the paper curl and turn to ash. He whispered her name into the smoke, not in hatred, but in acceptance. Some wounds, he finally understood, were not meant to heal. They were meant to fade quietly. 7 years after Ethan's release, the story that had once captured national attention faded into quiet memory. Laura had moved to another town, trying to live a normal life under her real name again. But she never escaped the guilt that haunted her. One autumn morning, she received a letter from a former neighbor who still lived near the coast. Ethan, the man the world believed had found peace, had died in his sleep. There were no signs of struggle or illness, just a heart that had finally grown too tired to keep beating. He was 41. Laura traveled to the small seaside town where he had spent his final years. His grave lay at the edge of a windswept cemetery overlooking the ocean, marked only by a simple stone etched with his name and the words asterisk at last, still. Asterisk. She stood there for a long time, unable to speak. The wind carried the smell of salt and rain. The same scent that filled the night everything had fallen apart. From her bag, she pulled out a worn photograph from their wedding day. 2 smiling faces filled with light and promise, and placed it against the cold stone. As she traced his name with trembling fingers, tears welled in her eyes. She whispered a goodbye that came 7 years too late. The sun dipped behind the clouds, casting long shadows over the grass. For the first time, she understood that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about finally letting go. As she turned to leave, a soft breeze rustled through the trees, almost like a sigh. The storm that had once bound them together had finally passed, leaving only silence and the sound of distant waves. Their story, marked by love, loss, and regret, had finally come to its quiet end.